I'm Tom Groome. I'm the interim pastor at Lexington Presbyterian Church, and we did this study in Lexington in January, and I was trying to remember how many sessions. I think we did 8 or 9 sessions, so 45 minutes will not do justice for the origins, or Caste, the origins of our discontents. And so what we're going to do today is basically go through parts 1 and 2 of her book of 7 parts, and then we'll kind of talk about the 8 pillars of Caste. And so that kind of gets you through about 140, 150 pages of this book. And so she does an excellent job with that. And so we can go ahead and get started. I'm going to operate this slideshow here. And so in Caste, Isabel Wilkerson investigates the origins, the evolution, workings, and consequences of an invisible system that infiltrates every aspect of American life. Caste, she observes, is thought to be synonymous with India and is almost never used to explain the socio-economic divisions in the United States. But this system, when seen for what it is, and it is an artificial ranking of human value based on such immutable traits as ancestry and gender, emerges as the foundation upon which the entirety of American society is built. It's the basis of racism, and as she says, everything else that ends in ism. No inequality or discontent in American life can be fully understood without looking at it through the lens of caste. And so a caste system is an artificial construction that uses fixed but neutral human differences, such as ancestry and skin color, to rank people on an arbitrary scale of superiority and inferiority. It's the invisible infrastructure that underpins a society's divisions, the unofficial code that sets people's expectations of who should live in which neighborhood, have which job, get what quality of health care. And so caste, which is inherited and learned from childhood, becomes the unconscious guide to the way people speak and dress and process information and relate to others. No one is immune to the programming of their caste system. And so she uses an analogy that America is an old house. She says, we can never declare the work over. Wind and flood, drought and human upheavals batter a structure that is already fighting whatever flaws were left unattended in the original foundation. When you live in an old house, you may not want to go into the basement after a storm to see what rains have wrought. Choose not to look at, however, at your own peril. The owner of an old house knows that whatever you are ignoring will never go away. And so she also sees America as an unseen skeleton, a caste system that is as central to its operation as are the studs and the joists that we cannot see in the physical buildings that we call home. Caste is an architecture of human hierarchy, the subconscious code of instructions for maintaining, in our case, a 400-year-old social order. A caste system is an artificial construction, a fixed and embedded ranking of human value that sets the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of the other groups on the basis of ancestry and often immutable traits. And so she says race is the primary tool and the visible decoy. She calls it the front man for caste. Okay, and so we've got, in a caste system, there's a dominant caste, a subordinate caste, and any number of castes in between. The dominant caste is presumed to be superior based on its ancestry, skin color, gender, and other traits. The subordinate caste, the one presumed to be inferior because of its lack of these traits, occupies the bottom rung of the makeup of the social ladder. And so she goes into pretty good detail, and I won't do that today, about the three prominent caste systems in human history. We've got Nazi Germany, we've got India, and of course the United States. But she does go into very detailed, but for the sake of time, we're not going to talk about those. Then she also talks about a image of a lone dissenter amid a crowd of Germans giving the Nazi salute. This was in Hamburg, Germany in 1936. There's 100 or so shipyard workers, and this lone dissenter, his name was August Landmesser. He had joined the Nazi Party years earlier, but found out firsthand that what the Nazis were feeding the Germans lies about the Jews. He was also in love with a Jewish woman, and so Nuremberg laws had made their relationship illegal, forbidden to marry on sexual relations. And so this was an act of bravery to stand against in ocean. And so we had a pretty good discussion at Lex Pres about what would it mean to be this man today. So any comments about that? To be the one against 100?
I think with that man, certainly he was courageous, but it was also an act of desperation.
Yeah, courageous and desperation, absolutely.
Tom, do we know, did he suffer legally? Was he punished for that act?
I don't know. I tried to find the photo, but I could not find it. But we do know it's 1936 in Hamburg.
And you wonder what is keeping other maybe kind of like-minded people from putting their hands down when they see someone like that. Because it draws attention to, there's differing of opinions and it's uniformity, but even within all the people giving the salute, you wonder what was keeping the sympathetic ones.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of go along with the crowd.
Right.
Right. Okay, let's move on. Okay, and so she talks about the emergence of caste in America, and she talks about Virginia in 1630. That's where the hierarchy began to form. Few Africans were seen as significant enough to be listed in the census by name, as would be the case for generations to follow, in contrast to the majority of European inhabitants, indentured or not. The Africans were not cited by age or arrival date, as were the Europeans. Information vital to setting the terms and time frame of indenture for Europeans or for Africans. They had been seen, had they been given the same category, been seen as equal or seen as needing to be accurately counted for. And so thus, before there was even a United States of America, there was a caste system born right here in colonial Virginia. She talks about a work day in South Carolina. So in 1740, like other slaveholding states, finally decided to limit the work day of enslaved African Americans to 15 hours a day from March to September, and to 14 hours from September to March, despite the normal workday for human beings were about half that who actually got paid for their labor. For their ceaseless exertions of their waking hours, many consisted on a peck of corn a week, which they had to mill by hand by night after their labors in the fields. And so she also has a couple of statistics. She says in the year 2022, the United States will have been an independent nation for as long as slavery lasted here on our soil. And then in 2111, African Americans as a group will have been free for as long as they have been enslaved. So some pretty telling statistics there. Then she goes on to kind of give some personal stories about, one is Harold Hale. Hale was born in the 1950s in Selma, Alabama. And as a young boy, he watched white people call his mother and his grandmother by their first name. And so he also was part of the Martin Luther King March across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. He was a teenager at the time. He was unharmed physically. And he decided to stand up to the dominant caste system by naming his firstborn daughter Miss. And she talks about some other issues with that, with her going off to school in Texas, and how the principal was like, "No, what's your first name, Miss? What's your first name?" You know, and so that was really to give no one in the dominant caste the option to call her by the title that they had denied his mother and his grandmother. Then Wilkerson also talks of a personal situation. She was a correspondent for the New York Times, and she was doing a story on the Chicago Miracle Mile, and how she had gone from business to business writing a story for that, and how she went to the last business and the manager was not there. She kind of waited for him. He finally got there. She introduced herself, and he says, "No, I'm waiting for someone from the New York Times." And so she just kept trying to tell him that she was from the New York Times, and he wouldn't have any of it. So personal story from her standpoint. And then she goes on to say that color is a fact, race is a social construct. And then she goes on to talk about the difference between racism and casteism. She says, any action or institution that mocks, harms, assumes, or attaches inferiority or stereotype on the basis of the social construct of race can be considered racism. Any action or structure that seeks to limit, hold back, or put someone in a defined ranking seeks to keep people in their place by elevating or denigrating that person on the basis of their perceived category can be seen as casteism. She says casteism is the investment in keeping the hierarchy as it is in order to maintain your own ranking, advantage, privilege, or elevate yourself above others or keep others beneath you. And so I thought that was pretty telling. Color is a fact. Race is a social construct. Any comments about that?
So, Tom, casteism does exist outside of racism. So it might be casteism about ability, disability issues, or casteism about any other number of other things.
Correct.
One of the things that I've experienced is often when we talk about racism, anti-racism, is how much class comes into our discussions, so that people who have struggled economically will say, well, I was disadvantaged too.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
it's hard sometimes to disentangle other things that enter into the conversation when we talk about race.
Yeah. Yeah. She talks about I don't have it part of my slides, but she talks about a conference that she went to, and there was a African lady who was talking, and after the conference, Ms. Wilkerson went and introduced herself and was talking to her, and the lady from Africa said, "It's interesting that there are no blacks in Africa." And she talked about all the different tribe names. She said they don't become black until they come to the UK or the United States. And I thought that was pretty telling. Yeah. All right. And then we've got the famous quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. "Silence in the face of evil is evil itself. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." And that kind of sums up parts 1 and 2. I think that's about 10 chapters, 15 chapters or so. And then we can get into the 8 pillars of caste. Any questions before we move on to the 8 pillars?
I was going to say, just to follow up on Nancy's, do you think casteism would be an effective category to kind of include more systems of oppression, or if you're talking about those, if the term intersectionality makes somebody uncomfortable, do you think casteism is a way to explain it in a different way that might be effective differently?
Yeah, I mean, she talks about how race is more of the skin and caste is the bones. You know, it's the skeleton, whereas race is just the skin. And so it's all inherent. You know, we grow up thinking, you know, ways in which we, you know, speak or ought to have a job or health care, and we don't really consider, you know, that others don't have the same opportunities. And so, you know, many of us kind of start out behind the 8 ball, so to speak, where others are, you know, got it world on a plate.
For me that was most profound was the comparison between the systems in India, Nazi Germany, and the U.S., and the fact that the Nazis had intentionally come to the U.S. and to study
Yeah.
what we were doing. When you tend to think of the horrible atrocities of the Nazis,
Yep.
they were parallel to ours, and that was shocking. I also, and I'm not sure I completely understand why South Africa was not included, but apparently people can earn their way out of the caste systems in South Africa,
Mm-hmm.
where the others are carved in stone.
Yeah. So you've read the book.
Uh-huh.
Okay, great. How many of you have read the book?
I have 100 pages left to go.
Okay. All right. All
There
right.
was a discussion later where there's 3 women talking. There's an Irish American, let's see, it's an Irish American, an Italian American, and then there's this other woman, and then they're sort of saying, oh, you know, tell us about your family, where you're from, blah, blah, blah. They go on, and finally they turn to the third woman, and they say, well, where was your family from? And she says, they're Nordic. And the other 2 women fell silent because, for whatever reason, Nordic is higher than Irish, Italian. The Northern Europeans were considered in a higher caste, which I found very problematic. But anyway,
Yeah, for those of you who've read the book, you remember the study. I think the teacher was from Iowa, and the kids that had blue eyes and brown eyes, and how, you know, she started teaching or talking to them about, okay, this week if you have brown eyes, then you're not seen as important as those who have blue eyes, and how the kids immediately started gravitating toward treating each other differently. And then she switched the roles on the next week. Those who had the brown eyes were treated, you know, differently from those who had the blue eyes. And it was very interesting. Do you remember more about that? Yeah.
you know, if a teacher today, I can't remember the date on that, but
Yeah.
if a teacher today did that, they'd be censored. A teacher was teaching
Yeah.
how people picked cotton, and that was determined to be racist, and I don't know if she lost her job finally on appeal or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think we've all gotten so sensitive, and my heart goes out to teachers that are simply trying to teach something, and it's been labeled critical race theory. And I just think, I mean, I'm not really sure what critical race theory is, but it's become very negative to the people on one end of the spectrum.
Right.
I also think where caste is interesting, because it is sort of, if you say that racism has impacted the U.S. police and legal system, you'll have people say, so you're saying our police are bad, you're saying our laws are bad. But if you put it in the terms of caste and saying like it sort of disarms, or it gives you a different way to view, you know, the way we've set things up based on color. You know, there's a fact that we're all different colors, and
Mm-hmm.
that has impacted the way we've set various things up. And so I wonder if caste can catch on as a way to sort of critique and get at it in a different way that may be not as politically charged over here. I don't know how it would go over
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
In some ways, it can be seen as more neutral,
Mhm.
perhaps.
Yeah, at
rather
least
than-
here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, doesn't the word caste fly at the heart of American self-understanding? Like, who we believe ourselves to be as a classless, or, you know, that we can all work hard. That's, to me, caste, I think of my own family, you know, that the idea of caste being an American experience would just like, would not even something they would agree to even hold as a possibility, because America is the place where you can work hard and, you know, my dad is one, built himself up by his bootstraps, right? But race is something that at least my family can acknowledge as a problem. They might not think of themselves as racist, but, you know, me, of course, I'm perfect in every way, but it's all my family's fault. I'm teasing, of course, but, you know, I just think of folks that have a hard time with these conversations that I am in relationship with. I wouldn't even begin to talk about caste as a way to.
I guess I'm speaking out of my experience. The minute we talk about dismantling systemic racism, or racism in the church, or race in general, it immediately becomes, we retreat to our side in a corner. I can't tell you how many people have said to me, so you're telling me the Peace of USA says I'm a racist?
No, you're right. Yeah.
I think we have to look at where we've come from. I think, who knows why I decided to study our church's history from 1832 on, reading the session minutes that I got on microfiche from theological seminary. And I'm finding some things that are genuinely shocking. That if I was to tell one of my dear friends who's the wife of the senator who also sits down the pew from me, I mean, she would be just tremendously upset about it. But it happened, and it happened right at Clarksville Presbyterian.
Okay. Well, let's move on to the 8 pillars of caste. So, pillar number 1, divine will and the laws of nature. She says all caste systems sell the idea that they are above human control, that they are ordained by a higher power or laws of nature. She says Hinduism explains how India's 4 main castes were formed. And then the story of Noah and the Great Flood has historically been used to justify the caste system in the U.S. From the Middle Ages, some interpreters of the Bible took it to mean that Ham, whose descendants Noah condemned to a life of servitude, had dark skin. The curse against Ham's descendants was considered a curse against everyone with dark skin. And then pillar number 2, heritability. Clear lines of demarcation in which everyone was ascribed a rank at birth and a role to perform. In the U.S., dating back to colonial Virginia, children inherited the caste of their mother, both by law and by custom. The fixed nature of caste distinguishes it from class. And she says class is a measure of one's standing in society, marked by a level of education, income, and occupation. These are acquired by hard work or lost through poor decisions. And she says if you can act your way out of it, then it is class, not caste. And then 3rd, endogamy and control of marriage. Endogamy is restricting marriage to people within the same caste and forbids marriage outside of one's group. And then she says endogamy makes it more likely that those in the dominant caste will see those deemed beneath them as not only less than human, but as an enemy. And then she kind of gives some examples there. Hugh Davis in 1630, Mr. Davis was a white man, and he was sentenced to public whipping for sleeping with a black woman. It was the first attempt at setting boundaries of publicly known relationships across caste lines. And then 1640, Robert Sweet, he was a white man. He got a slave woman pregnant, and she was the one that took the punishment. And then 1691, Virginia became the first colony to outlaw marriage between blacks and whites. And the U.S. Supreme Court did not overturn these prohibitions until 1967.
Which actually was a Virginia couple.
It was what?
A Virginian
couple.
Oh. Oh.
Love, yeah, they have a great, if you haven't watched it, it's on Netflix. It's a great rendition. I'm sure it's not all accurate, but I think it tells the story well.
Yeah.
I didn't realize Virginia was the first one to outlaw it.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Yeah.
What's the name of that movie?
Isn't it Love? I think it's after the gentleman's last name.
Yeah.
It was a white man and
Loving.
Okay.
Loving.
Loving.
Loving. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Sure. Okay, pillar number 4, purity versus pollution. The dominant caste is considered pure, and all efforts are made to protect it against pollution by the subordinate caste. And then she talks about Homer Plessy, 1892. Mr. Plessy was a shoemaker in New Orleans. He had light-colored skin. He was an African American, but he had light-colored skin, so it kind of looked white. And he bought a train ticket from New Orleans to Covington, Louisiana, which is about a 40-mile trip. And of course, they were asking him to go sit at, the African American car, and he wouldn't do it. And so his case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which the Supreme Court ruled 7-1 in favor of Louisiana's separate but equal law. And so it set in motion 7 decades of really state-sanctioned isolation, exclusion of one caste from the other in the United States. Then, of course, she talks about the use of immigration and marriage laws to control the dominant caste. She goes several pages with that. Then pillar number 5, occupational hierarchy. In all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. Senator from South Carolina, James Henry Hammond. Then they talk about the mudsill hierarchy, where the mudsill is kind of sloped. And so as the water, drips from the rain, it will drip off. And so those who do the menial duties will be the ones who will slip and slide off the mudsill. 1890, 85% of black men and 96% of black women were employed in just 2 occupational categories: agriculture and domestic or personal service. So, any thoughts or questions so far?
That one's an interesting one where you get into the economic class part of it.
Right.
With not just looking down on people who do the menial duties, but at first paying them nothing and then paying them less.
Right. Yeah, and Senator Hammond was he was pretty much a scumbag. To put it lightly, he sexually molested a few of his nieces, and he just wasn't a good person. All right, number 6, dehumanization and stigma. Dehumanization is a war against truth, against what the eye can see and what the heart could feel if allowed to do so on its own. To dehumanize the group, and if you completed the work of dehumanizing any single person within it. And then the dominant caste steers a deliberate process of robbing people in the subordinate caste of their individuality and their dignity. African captives in colonial America were stripped of their names and their past identities. And then,
Section minutes.
excuse me?
In our section minutes, and this is post-Civil War.
Yeah.
They list the colored members and Matilda, servant of Mr. Johnson. And no last name, but servant of, not slave, servant.
But also, we think of this as a convention, but, right? If you read session minutes as well, you often cannot find out women's first names. They are always Mrs. John Smith, Mrs. They apparently have no identity outside of their
Yeah.
marriage status.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, the story that you said about, Miss Pell,
Yeah.
someone asked me about, as a female pastor, it almost feels like you should have your first name as pastor. Because it's interesting just how, male pastors do receive that title easier or more often than female.
Yeah.
So when you share that, I mean, maybe I've read that story before, but maybe it just hits home a little bit more now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That was fascinating.
Also, the crossing of the castes, I guess. Miss in the story from the book, it's taken as like you won't call her that because you don't respect her, but then the other one, it's your identity is based on your husband, so we're going to deny the individuality of it. It's sort of an interesting category of, it's used to oppress, but also live.
Oh,
No,
yes.
it's-
Yeah.
Yes.
To those it was denied to.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a weapon in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's,
You were going to say something?
Well, just, I think the same point as, when I used to work in women's ministries, and the white women would all go by our first names, and the women of color would all insist on being called Reverend, whatever their last name was, and I didn't get it until I got it. I mean,
Yeah.
that it was very much an issue of, coming out of that heritage and insisting on being respected for the, whereas we were trying to be non-hierarchical, right, and all go by our first names. So, well, there was a whole different kind of hierarchy going on that the white women were oblivious to.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, number 7, terror as enforcement. The only way to keep an entire group beneath all others and beneath their own talents is with violence and terror, psychological and physical, to preempt resistance before it can be imagined. And of course, we know that the whip was the most common instrument of punishment. And number 8, inherent superiority versus inferiority. Continual reminder of the inborn superiority of the dominant caste and the inherent inferiority of the subordinate. And so that kind of takes us through part 3. And then, as I said, there are seven parts to her book. Part 4, she talks about the tentacles of caste. Part 5, the consequences of caste. Then part 6 is backlash. And then part 7 is the awakening. And so I hope this has spurred on some interest in your church or individual or book clubs and that type of thing. As I said, I think we did 8 or 9 sessions on this, and it was well received. We probably had 30 people. We had to do it during Zoom because it was in January. But and then also, if you're going to lead it, there's this little summary analysis of caste, and it goes through different chapters and key takeaways for that, and it will help you in leading the discussion on that. So I would definitely recommend that. So any questions to close us out?
Does she offer a hope-filled or a vision of breaking caste?
She does.
She does.
She does. And she talks about some personal situations too that helped her as well. So yeah, it's I think it does offer some hope, does it not?
I'm getting to that part.
Oh, okay. It does. Yeah. You're the one.
Yeah, there's just so much to
Oh yeah. We got a long ways to go, but yeah.
Not that I always want to jump to the fixer,
Yeah, you got to go through the mud first before you. Yeah.
Yeah, I almost stopped reading at the very beginning, after I don't know how many pages. But when she was going through the brutality of slavery and what happened in Germany, I just thought each episode was more brutal. I don't know how many more of these I could read.
Yeah.
But then, I think she had to do that to sort of set the scene And then she has really developed it in lots of different ways, so I'm glad I stuck with it, but I'm continuing to stick
Yeah.
with it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for being here, and I hope you, if you haven't read it, you will.
Well, thank you.
And
Yeah, thank you.
so great. Thank you.